Yeah, and that's when Daniel showed up. And so Daniel, you had done your engineering training at Trinity and then at MIT. So walk us through a little bit about your academic and intellectual background.
I did civil engineering at Trinity College in Dublin, and then I came over to the U.S. and I found it was incredibly difficult to find a job just to go through the mechanics of it. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just go to graduate school instead, which sadly it was as shallow as that. No, it probably wasn't. But I went to MIT and I did a master's degree in civil engineering. But at the time, it would have been around 1991, 92, 93. The use of computer technology was getting cheaper, and so it was more pervasive. And so obviously, while I'm there, I'm not going to be busting concrete beams or cubes. I'm going to be looking at what the current computer technology is, AI and so on and so forth. People were much more optimistic about AI in the early 90s than they were in the late 90s. And so I had been doing computer programming, and then I went over to take some classes at Harvard with you. I think it would have been 1995. I may have been in your first personality psychology class or your second. I'm not quite sure. And we started programming the neuropsych stuff. The work that you guys had done and that Jean Séguin had done in Montreal had used a paper and pencil version of the psych tests, and those psych tests were kind of modified from use with people with clinical issues and with experimental animals. So it was an interesting kind of a transformation of using something to detect clinical differences to detect individual differences. And at the time, the idea of a prefrontal cognitive ability really didn't, as far as I know, it didn't really exist. People spoke about executive function, but they didn't speak about it in individual differences terms. They spoke about it more in a sort of a global, like what would happen if executive function did or didn't exist. And so we computerized the types of tests that you'd been using with the Sons of Male Alcoholics, and that Jean Séguin had been using with, I believe, impulsive children, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then we did I think it was 1997. You were teaching the personality class, and we did the online computerized personality lab.
Right.
Which was, and that was early web days. And so we did that. We had, I guess...
We did like 100 experiments at once. It
was
really something, eh? Was it Netscape? What was the first browser?
It was pretty much right after Netscape came out. It was fairly early. In computer days, it was when Perl was the way that you would do, Perl CGI programming was the way you do web stuff. And so we essentially set up a bunch of experiments. My wife, Alice Lee, and I programmed them. And all the kids in the class took them. It was like, I think probably about 140. And they divided up into groups of 5 to do the analysis. So we did a soup to nuts set of, as you said, maybe 15, 20 different experimental questions.
Yeah. Well, it was this battery of tests that I had developed with Séguin and Bob.
Yeah.
It took, like, a lot of it required gadgets and lights and boxes, and it was very mechanical. It also took about 9 to 11 hours for a trained neuropsychologist to administer the test battery. But when we computerized it, we got the whole damn thing down to 90 minutes. And so then we were interested in, we thought, well, we could use this test battery to assess psychopathology, impulsivity, but then could we use it to assess normative or even excellent performance? And Daniel and I and Bob started to investigate the possibility of using prefrontal cognitive ability tests to assess academic prowess at Harvard and at the University of Toronto, as it eventually turned out. And we also started to move into the corporate world. And so that was part of an entrepreneurial vision at that point as well, because we thought, well, I had started studying papers that were produced by, God, now I'm not going to be able to remember, unfortunately, the names of the people who produced the initial equations relating increased accuracy of selection to economic outcome.
Hunter and Schmidt.
Hunter and Schmidt, yeah. Absolutely crucial papers showing that. So one of the things we learned for everyone watching and listening is that a tiny minority of extremely high performers produce almost all the economic outcome of a given endeavor. So it's actually the square root of the number of people involved in a given endeavor do half the work. It's like the 80-20 rule, is almost a very small minority of your customers produce all your profits. A small minority of your workers produce all your productive outcome. A small minority of creative people produce almost all the creative output. A small number of criminals commit almost all the crimes. And so what that means is that if you can tilt your selection methods, your hiring methods, towards the upper end, even a small amount, and thereby increase the number of extremely top performers that you have in your organization, the economic payoff to that is unbelievably dramatic. So I think Schmidt and Hunter estimated at that point that if the US bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy, switched to accurate assessment for hiring, which they're actually bound to do by law, they would save an amount each year equivalent to total American corporate profits. And I read that and I thought, oh my God, if we can develop a new way of assessing ability that's accurate, we should be able to go to corporations and say, look, for a relatively small amount of money, we can radically increase the productivity of your employees. And I thought we could just make a statistical case that the payoff for that would be so great that, people would literally beat a path to our door. And so that was a very naive presumption. Now, you were put right in the center of this, because in order to pursue this for your PhD, you decided to come and do a PhD in psychology. You had to master the neuropsychological literature. You had to master the literature on IQ testing, because one question that came up was, well, was there a difference between prefrontal cortical ability, let's say, the ability, cognitive abilities that are dependent on the forward part of the brain, the part that abstracts action before it's implemented. What was the relationship between that and IQ? And most of the neuropsychologists regarded IQ tests as these dusty, ancient technologies that had been superseded, and just assumed that what they were measuring was something separate. But that had never really been rigorously tested. And then you also had to become a master of the relevant literature on personality, because personality traits like conscientiousness are also useful at predicting performance. And so why don't you talk a little bit about the development of your thesis, and also the fact that you wrote your thesis at the same time that the bell curve came out. And that was quite the political nightmare, all things considered. So why don't you walk through what you did for your PhD research and your thesis?
Well, we sort of hit a perfect storm in a way, because Herrnstein and Murray's bell curve had just been published, which was the most vilified book of the 90s, if you like. And Herrnstein and Murray were both at Harvard, although Herrnstein had just passed away. And the neuropsych guys had been speculating on the way the brain works under normal circumstances, based on research that they had done with clinical populations. And they essentially completely ignored the statistical methods that are required to talk about individual differences in cognitive ability and individual differences in outcomes, differences across situations.